The following program is a parent's version of a lesson plan given to your El Camino high schooler in their Connect group. It's provided to you, firstly, to let you see what's going on and what's being taught in the series, and secondly, more importantly, to encourage you to interact with your son or daughter when aspects of this series become tangible and visible in our society through several avenues like legislation, schools, and the media. So welcome to our first session called Back from the Future. You might want to ponder why the title. It's primarily because when your high schooler, when your student sees a glimpse of what the future holds for them, they may want to return to the now, be thankful that they live in the now, and then to get better prepared for what's coming in terms of ideologies, changes in social order, changes in values, and those are the things we're going to be talking about in this particular series. So one of the examples of some of the things that are already changing is this notice from Brown University about a new class, a new course that's taking on. It's called Unlearning Toxic Masculinity. This is primarily feeding the LGBTQ forum, which wants to redefine the gender roles and especially is upset with the traditional view of what masculinity is and wants us to unlearn that. That's kind of the thing that's taking hold, even though it's not named by some of the modern philosophical terms. It's the effect of those terms now in society. Another one is from a European molecular biology organization talking about the postmodern assault on science. If all truths are equal, who cares what science has to say? This is an assault on the whole concept of truth. It's presented by the European Molecular Biology Organization, but it's an example of how this kind of thinking is filtering down into normally staid and true institutions that we rely on every day. Also, in terms of religion, here Pope Francis is being reported by CNN, tells a gay man, God made you like that and loves you like that. Contrary, of course, to traditional historic teaching of the Catholic Church with respect to homosexual lifestyle and so on. There's nothing wrong with the notion that God loves us in whatever state we are, but certainly doesn't want us to remain that way, nor does he condone any of the sinful habits that we have as we come to him. So that's kind of part of what's happening in this philosophy, in this sort of worldview. And we're going to take this a little bit of a step at a time. This title here is A Crisis of Truth. This is the first section of our session today. And most people might not think that there's a particularly big crisis for truth. If you're a churchgoer, if you have conservative values, we all agree that truth is one of those given things. It's just out there, it's self-evident. But today there's such a thing as a crisis for that truth, people doubting whether truth can be known. Someone out there is really competing for your mind. That's a pretty profound statement. But there are folks out in the world that you're going to be entering who are going to be competing for the attention span of your mind and for your thought patterns and even for your philosophical ideas. And as we look at a timeline of a person's life, there are two stages. One of them is obviously childhood, and the other one at the end of the line is adulthood. We're all heading for an adult behavior, an adult lifestyle, an adult season of our lives. In childhood, there's a lack of control, lack of the ability to decide what you wear, what you eat, where you sleep, what activities go on, when you go to bed. That sort of thing is all done for you by someone else. You don't really have much control over it. And in adulthood, we all recognize that almost everything is in our control that we care about. Our clothes, what schools we go to, what cars we buy, what houses we live in, what careers we take on for ourselves. Even though there are other controls that are outside of our ability to control them, those are the things that are essential, and adulthood is one of those phases where that all comes true. But it comes by rite of passage. The area that we concentrate on here is adolescence. It's like a gateway or a doorway through which a child passes as they are heading for adulthood. And many people regard this, many philosophers regard this as sort of a garden of delights, because they have the attention span of a young person, and they can begin to introduce ideas they had not thought of before in childhood. And this is the time when the formation of lasting values really needs to take place, because the adolescent is now intelligent enough to understand what those values can mean. And so if parents aren't doing it, or if churches aren't doing it very well, then certainly the schools and the liberals and progressives in our society will take over for them. So that's the purpose of this chart, is to show that this is a ripe time for us to mold and to straighten the lives of young people as they head towards adulthood. But things that are being really challenged in terms of a crisis of truth are: what is true? What is right? What is right and wrong? Where is meaning? These are the essential calling tags of philosophies and worldviews today. And they're being challenged. And as your child enters senior high school and into early college, there'll be plenty of people who will be challenging these particular views. So in terms of a crisis, we as Christians don't think there is much of one, but in actuality, there are several ways to look at it. One is the reality of things, and this is a sort of a plaything of philosophers to challenge whether the tree that you see out there in the meadow is really there. Are our senses merely interpreting the world differently than it actually is? And it's sort of a plaything, but to be honest with you, not many skeptics or scholars worry about this aspect, the aspect of empirical perception of the world around us, because to be quite frank, it's not worth it to worry about that in a practical world. You have to pretty much accept that your senses are seeing the world as it really is, and there are good arguments that support that, even though they can be doubted. But what we're really talking about in terms of a crisis of truth is the truths that others tell us, whether that be parents or teachers or leaders at church and leaders in our society, the media, other places. And these are all in the form of these particular keywords here: ideas. Ideas are ways of explaining things and explaining the basis, the foundation, the universal truths that might be behind something. And some of those ideas have come from, well, we've had a long history of traditional values and ideas being the mode of day, and now those things are being questioned. Also, claims. Claims are claims about the truth of something. Are they really true? Are the claims that our parents say about the way of life that has made America great really true? The same for traditions. The tradition of the Constitution is a good example being questioned today. Is it really true that the best government is the one that the founders put together? And we accept that by tradition. Do we necessarily have to always accept it that way? Can it change? Norms are things that are a little bit different than traditions. Obviously, you can't go to school wearing your underwear on the outside of your clothes. It's not against the law. You haven't broken a moral law, but you have broken a norm, and administrators and teachers will send you home because you are violating a norm that's expected for human behavior. Are those norms legit? Who sets them? Do they really have to apply? Can I break them without any consequences? And of course, the good old right and wrong of morality. Whose morality am I sponsoring and having to live by? Can I have my own? Is there something like a universal truth in that way? All of these things are then being examined. And even the very notion of truth. There are some folks today who are saying that the very idea that you can find truth in this world is questionable. So those are the kinds of things that are happening. Here's a typical scene of a young person in high school with their parents. It's an obvious scene you've probably seen before. Neither side understands the other. The young lady doesn't seem to appreciate the worldview and the values that are being placed on her, the restrictions that those imply, and says that they don't get me. They just don't understand me. And the parents are saying, That's true. We don't understand her way of life or her values or her worldview. Where's it all coming from? Why can't she be like us? Here are another set of parents, and I'm sure that many a child has seen this kind of look from their parents. It's one that says, you're not living up to the standards or the goals that we've set for you, and you're disappointing us. In many ways, kids are finding out that they're really being asked to live their parents' worldview as they are children. And parents justify this by saying, look, we're paying the bills, we're doing the job of raising you while you live in our house. You need to follow our rules and look at the world our way. A typical statement by a father might be, my father taught me how to live, now I'm teaching you. And then the mom might be saying something like, hey, we live by the traditions that made this country great, and so are you. Those are typical statements, and kids today are questioning whether those things are in fact true. And one of the reasons they're questioning it is because it's truth by authority. It's truth by somebody else telling us what we are to believe and value. And they might say, what is their world, meaning the world of their parents, produced? We have two world wars, which were the bloodiest in history. Vietnam, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, all of these things not necessarily settling the problems they were meant to solve. And so young people look at the world of the adult and say, I'm not so sure it's producing, it's gaining the kinds of things that are being claimed for it. The world of your parents and grandparents couldn't stop the 60s from happening. They couldn't stop the sexual revolution regardless of the nature of their values. They couldn't stop the AIDS epidemic, which was related to the sexual revolution. Their world is full, in other words, the parents' world that they've created is full of corruption in government, porn at your fingertips through the internet, prejudice and discrimination are still in play. Minorities resort to violence. This is the world they see, and then they hear parents saying, but this is the values, these are the values that made our country great, and the young person is questioning, how has that worked out? We also see a president who's breaking the molds in terms of government and the way Washington works, and some people are appreciating that, but he's personally disgusting as a role model. The things that he says and does in his personal life and his personal way of speech, his way of tackling problems are not role models for our kids. So we're living in an age when that is present. Here's an example. You have a CNN spoof in which the president is being played by an actor, and the real porn star, Stormy Daniels, is on the phone, and they're having a conversation and a disagreement about things. But nonetheless, they're portrayed as having a relationship. This is a time when we would never have a president, think of having a president in this kind of a position. Back in the days of Reagan, back in the days of Nixon, of Kennedy, they may have had their moral difficulties, but we don't see them in this kind of a position in a public forum. And so that this is not just a comedy skit, Mike, come on, it's just a comedy skit. Here's a real headline. Fox News' Chris Wallace a few weeks back had this headline. Rudy Giuliani has revealed that President Trump reimbursed his top lawyer for hush money paid to a porn star. That's not a comedy skit. That's real news. So we're living in an age when those kinds of things are being challenged, and a child today, a young person today, is going to question whether these things are the values they should embrace. So many citizens, we might not be surprised, say that they hate America. And that's a strange thing, because when I was a kid, that kind of thought would never have crossed any of our minds. Here's the anatomy of social violence that we see experienced in the headlines and on TV and in real places around our country. Everywhere you look, traditional institutions have failed. And those that want to still have something that's valuable invent their own personal systems for how things ought to be. These, however, also fail. In other words, the ones that we invent for ourselves fail. And this just brings about widespread frustration. You can't rely on the traditional institutions, and the ones that I make up for myself don't really click, don't really work as well as I thought. So what you get is just frustration. And they resort then to anger, rude behavior, and violence. And we're seeing that more and more because that seems to be the only communication method that they can get some kind of a stage for and get some kind of effectiveness for. Here's a case of a young man who is talking about abortion and the evils of abortion, and he's being challenged by a social warrior, a social justice warrior type person, and she is in his face, and eventually she just destroys his sign. That's her way of dealing with the conflicts in ideology and the conflicts in social values. That's her method, and that's a common scene today. Here's a young lady who's livid and upset with a Trump supporter, and she just cannot believe that someone would be this crazed or this stupid to actually support someone like him. And you can see here, the lady, her only way of speaking is to have a tantrum in a session where she's hearing somebody speak, and her way of reacting to it is to simply have a tantrum in her seat. Here's another lady who's about to clock a young man who is a Trump supporter, and she's a Trump hater. And if this film were to be advanced a few frames, you would actually see her smack him. That's the kind of reaction, the violence and the anger that is in our society today. Here are some religious inroads in terms of witches, people who are involved in witchcraft and have a group that wants to advertise their wares, their philosophy, their ideology, their religious values for Satan in a public place like a mall. And with all this distrust and anger about how mankind treats one another, you wonder where the Bible sits. Why isn't the Bible speaking to folks? Because it would have a message there. We obviously know this message: you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. With everyone wondering about where truth is, why isn't this message being seen? Why can't they see it? And the truth is that they see it just as someone else telling them what's true. That's just somebody else telling me what's true. And so we have to win the argument by explaining who the source is, why the source of this statement is more reliable than anything else. And the answer, of course, is they need a transformation to see it. And that transformation doesn't just come by argumentation, talking. So here's a timeline of worldviews. It's the horizontal plane of ideas that we see around us. And everyone in various groups are hawking their own version of the truth. Here's the truth, here's the truth. And you might be puzzled as to which group to try. And there are some folks who actually go through a series, a long gauntlet of trying one, then the next, and becoming quite bitter and frustrated at the end of that cycle. But of course, the kingdom of God is above all of these things. It extends from the beginning of time to our present time and over all of human society. It's been there, it is there, it will be there. And in order to see that kingdom where real truth resides, you've got to have a transformation. And that transformation, unfortunately, won't come from anyone else but the Lord. So here's a statement by Paul: be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's Paul's statement about how we are to be renewed. And this kind of transformation, again, isn't going to come from the crowd, isn't going to come from the horizontal experience and interaction that we have with others. It's got to come from the living God. It's got to come from the residents of the kingdom. And that has to happen spiritually. And until that does, there's going to be this dilemma of where truth exists, who's telling me the right things, and how do I live? So how did we get here? In the world after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have the medieval world, the world of the church age, in which almost everything in society revolved around a relationship with the church, and in this case, the Holy Roman Catholic Church. Kings were crowned and approved and wanted the blessing of the church, and if you ran afoul of the church, things went very badly for you. If you were going to be a significant person in society, as opposed to simply a thief or a rascal or someone of ill repute, you had to have a relationship with the church. That has changed. even though today, as we look at modern society, we do see the church still very prominent, even though the modern world is growing up around it, lots of people still regard the church as a source of truth and understanding in this world. But of course, things have changed. In the mid-20th century, doubt began to seriously and philosophically take hold in many people's lives. Those especially who were tired of the church being in control or didn't understand why it was so essential to be so. So we have statements like these coming into the headlines. Facts are like cows. If you look them in the face long enough, they'll generally run away. Now, most of you don't know who Sayers is, and some of these quotes you won't necessarily recognize, but that's the kind of thing that's being published. And facts, as you know, are supposedly the ingredients of reality. They're the things that we really look to establish the truth of something. Tell me the facts, show me the evidence. And in that way, we establish what we believe is a better truth, a better understanding of truth. But now we have somebody who is saying, if you look at them long enough, they'll change. They're transitory. They're not permanent. Here's another one. It's enough for me to be sure that you and I exist at this moment. So for Gabriel Marquez, the only thing that he can know for sure is that he's standing there and you're standing there and that they're hearing each other's ideas. But as to the rest of things that are around the world and the rest of the stories that are being said about the world, he's not so sure. Here's one. Believe those who are seeking the truth, doubt those who find it. That's a pretty cynical view, because he's saying it's good to seek the truth, but by the way, you're really never going to find it, and be doubtful and suspicious about somebody who says they have. And of course, that includes all Christians. Here's one from the famous Jane Austen. Seldom, very seldom, does complete truth belong to any human disclosure. Seldom can it happen that something is not a little disguised or a little mistaken. There's the famous Jane Austen saying virtually the same thing, doubting about the validity and permanency of truths. Here's Friedrich Nietzsche, who's a famous philosopher for fomenting the idea that God is dead. Here he says there are no facts, only interpretations. Now you think about throwing a rock at the young man in this stage when he was saying this, and say, is that a fact or is that an interpretation? And again, it's kind of a confusion as to what he's saying. He's really talking about facts that we claim in terms of explanations about how the world works. But it's a striking statement because he's in the category of people who say everything that we are told about reality is basically an interpretation of somebody else. John Lennon, famous John Lennon Beatles, in Strawberry Fields Forever has the line, "Nothing is real." So you can see how these ideas have permeated into our society, and give it another decade, they'll be even stronger. So again, this idea of interpretation comes about, the idea of the tree that we talked about a little earlier, that's the same kind of idea. So I'm going to throw a word out here that is probably going to throw you off balance, and you may even want to head for the exits because it sounds very heady. It's a $25 word, and it sounds very philosophical. It's the word postmodernism. Now, normally you would think of this as a big philosophical term. It has words that, pieces or parts of words that we understand, like post and modern, but we don't understand really how it's put together or what it means. And that's what philosophers love to do, is put up terms that you can't understand, and that makes them look all the more elite and erudite and ahead of the pack. But obviously, any word that we have that looks puzzling at first, as soon as you know what it means, isn't puzzling at all, isn't frightening at all. And that's what we intend to do as we talk about this a little bit later. Now, normally this kind of subject is in major universities and heady college courses in philosophy. We're not going to obviously go there because that's way beyond the intention of this series. What we're interested more is what are the effects of this way of thinking in society? What is society becoming as a result of men who have written about these subjects? So postmodernism is really just a reaction to modernism, and that's another term that most people don't use in parlance today. We really don't talk about what modernism is, but modernism was basically a reaction to the Catholic Church and the idea of divine truths, and it was part of the Enlightenment. It's an independence from authoritarian institutions. It's an independent spirit of mind. Science, research, experimentation all became part of it. You have exploration, investigation, knowledge. This is all part of the Renaissance age and the age of the Enlightenment. People began to think for themselves instead of constantly checking with the church as to whether their ideas were correct. Science and reason will discover all that is real. So it's now a challenge that if science and reason cannot discover a thing, it doesn't exist. And that, of course, is a challenge to faith and to beliefs that don't have a corporeal or an empirical way of testing. Man is the master of its own destiny. It's what I do and what my reason and my abilities, my education, my talents can do that really counts. Technology will solve all human deficiencies. Again, that's part of the modern world in which we currently live. Postmodernism comes along and says, no, that's all wrong. And they're not saying it from a Christian standpoint. You really need to be relying on God and the Bible and spiritual things. They're not saying that at all. They're saying there's no way to be assured of the reliability of all those things we just listed. There are no universal truths. There is only interpretation. You control the meaning, so forget what somebody wrote, what Tolstoy wrote, or Hegel, or anybody else. You control the meaning. Whatever meaning you bring to the text, that's the meaning that counts. So postmodernists reject the validity of old world concepts like the scientific method, logic, deduction, reasoning, objective truth. And remember, we had this article, Postmodern Assault on Science, in case you were wondering how could anybody attack the scientific method. Well, there you have it. They then substitute their own understanding of these subjects through a postmodern lens. They then develop their own version of truth using their own version of reason. Very important point. Their own version of truth using their own version of reason, which means, of course, that you can't correct them because they no longer hold the same standard of truth that you do. More and more in society, we're going to run into people who have this mindset. You can't correct a person. You can't bring some kind of reason to their understanding because they don't use the same words. The words don't have the same meaning. And that is a huge breakdown in communication. You can't communicate because each is speaking a different language. It's much like this picture. Each one doesn't understand why the other person doesn't understand them. And it's because the mind is being built up in a different orientation. And that's what's dangerous about the way the world is shaping up. Here's a case in which two people are in a rally, at a demonstration, and it's apparent that they're both just talking past each other. There's no dialogue. There's no learning from one another. That's typical of what's going on in most demonstrations and rallies today. Their own version of the truth. Columbus was the bad guy. America is racist. If you resist illegal immigration, you're racist. If you call gay sex sinful, you're a hater. This world view is taking over a new generation. And in fact, the more modern generations that exist, Generation X, Generation Y, or called the millennials, it's taking over that generation because those folks are seated in classrooms where teachers and professors are doling out this kind of change of thinking. What's true, what's right, so forth. Here are some of the areas in which postmodernism is affecting our society. Educators, people who train and educate our children, legislators, those people who are making the laws, the Supreme Court in terms of what is justice, Pastors are even questioning these areas and incorporating some aspect of postmodernism. Parenting, how you raise a child, childhood development, art, music, how we read. If you change the way in which a young person reads, you change his entire world. How we teach and understand history, those are all areas that are affected by postmodernism, and yet they are not going to be stamped with the word postmodernism on them. They're just going to have the same ideas embedded in their way of life. Again, we have this class from Brown University, Unlearning Toxic Masculinity, not stamped with postmodern, but it has all of the ideas that come from postmodern ways of thinking. So here's the horizon, you might say, the horizontal plane of answers that people are getting. And they tend to look on a horizontal plane for themselves, to themselves, among themselves, not realizing that there's a vertical plane, one that's always existed since the beginning of time. That plane includes God and Satan, and they have an influence. God is endeavoring to influence the world on its horizontal plane from a heavenly point of view. Hence the gospel, preaching the lives of believers, giving testimony about the kingdom and about the love of God through Jesus Christ. Then we have Satan trying to influence from below, to dissuade people from believing in God, from believing in those kinds of standards, and to create confusion, but also to destroy. So there is the kingdom, full of life, life eternal, and it's over all of these worldviews that a person might encounter, and yet very few people are being made to see it. So here we have the typical life of a high school student, the kind of life that they see every day, the obligations of a high school life. This is the typical high school. One of the things that we can appreciate is, despite the things we're talking about, a high schooler can say, look, I'm already heavily loaded. I'm already fully loaded. I don't need to think about a lot of other stuff. I need to just get through school. And so some of the things that they're concentrating on are obviously homework and grades, because they're getting that pressure and that encouragement from parents and from their teachers. But there's also things that are part of that life that are enjoyable, like school projects and plays. That complicates and adds to the mix of things that they need to worry about or be obliged to. There's sports, both for men and for women. And then there's the culture of popularity. That's invaded all of our high schools, and they learn this at a very early age. You need to avoid the mean girls in school because they can destroy the rest of your high school existence, if not the rest of your life. And it also goes for the boys, avoiding the mean boys. If you're too studious, you're called a nerd, and if you're from a poorer side of the tracks, you don't have the same wealth and live in the same part of town, you can be ostracized and picked on and made fun of. And that's the name of the game in most high schools. And so students that are supposed to be getting an education are faced with these dilemmas. There's also the great popularity of social media, your life on social media, how many likes you have on Twitter, how many people are following you, all of that. And communication is between devices. It's not between real people any longer. These are challenges for popularity that kids face in schools all the time. Again, in reality, while all these things occupy the mind of the average young person in high school, we've got to keep in mind that the kingdom of God is there. It's invisible, but it's visible by faith. And the high schooler has to ask the question, how do I get this message? How do I get this truth in the midst of all the other things that I have to be worried about? So as we continue next time, we're going to look at how art has been hijacked by this worldview. We're going to look at these kinds of paintings. As you can see, the stages of growth towards the modern have taken place. Why have these transitions taken place? And who controls the meaning of these pictures? We'll be talking about that. And the world now affected in TV, how TV has been affected by this particular worldview. We have two programs that will examine, the Cosby Show and the Seinfeld Show. The very different approaches to these things, one in the 80s, one in the 90s, and how the change in values has occurred across this medium. Also, we'll be asking questions like, who is Madonna? Who is Britney Spears? Who is Lady Gaga? And who is Eminem? In the interest of asking the question, what is this search for identity? When you ask these questions about who these people are, it depends on where they are, in which decade, or even on which day. So we're going to be talking about identity in that respect. What's going on with the craze for tattoos? Everyone wants one. Everyone has one, just about. Why is it such a craze? And piercings. The kinds of things that are being done in young people's lives. You wonder about the parents who are allowing their kids to go into society looking like this. But we want to examine why this has taken hold, why this is important to young people today. And we're done.